Alrighty, thank you everybody for attending today's roundtable. Today we have family trees and mental health, which is an AARCC roundtable discussion. With me today, I have Anjail Haqq. She is a mental health therapist specializing in the treatment of individuals, families, and groups in crisis. Anjail focuses on working with various target populations, including adults suffering from substance abuse, adults with significant disabilities, and foster care families. Anjail graduated from South Carolina State University, earning her bachelor's in social work. She's continued to study clinical social work and organizational community planning at the University of New England, earning her master's in social work degree. Hello, Anjail.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you for being here. Additionally, I have Shellie Baxter, who founded Our Genetic Legacies with the aim of correcting the published histories of America to include all Americans. The many contributions of multicultural American pioneers, their family histories have been relegated to a short list. OGL's mission is to create projects that will expand the list with the help made possible as a result of generous sponsorships and numerous volunteers. So thank you, Shellie, for being here.
Thank you.
So to get started, we will just start with a couple of questions while we get people rolling in and watching on the YouTube stream. And then as those questions come in, I, as moderator, will come in and talk a little bit. Before that, I should probably introduce myself. My name is Darian Hales. I am a part of AARCC. I'm the program coordinator. So if you've come to any of our February events, you've seen me running around. I have stepped in to do the moderation for today's roundtable. So let's go ahead and get started. So our first question is for both of you. And it is, why is it important to know one's roots?
You want to start, Anjail?
I sure can. So essentially, we're all looking for a sense of belonging to some extent. And the application of how we go about doing that can be various. So even if it's through our faith, if it's through our profession and what we do, we still want to find a sense of self. And I think understanding who we are is just one of those questions that keeps evolving through time, through age, through wisdom from different experiences that we have. And so understanding your roots is important because it's another piece that contributes to that.
And to piggyback on that, that's why I do the research that I do. And I believe that in knowing your roots, you're able to give eternal life to your ancestors because you can share those stories. You can see those, the big common threads that you share with your ancestors. And then you're able to keep sharing those with future generations to keep that memory and that person's life, livelihood, sacrifices alive.
And with that, will you talk a little bit about Our Genetic Legacy, just kind of explaining what it is and how you got started?
Sure. So Our Genetic Legacy, I started it in 2018. It was a result of 15 years of doing family tree research. My grandmother at one point had volunteered San Diego to be the host city for a family reunion. So she told me to do the family tree part. I'd seen the ancestry commercials and I thought all I needed to do was input the names, follow the little magic leaves, click on those, and then I would have my whole story. So I did that. And at one point I swore I was British royalty because I had traced myself back to the 1600s or so, I thought. And then when the DNA came out, I realized the complexity of doing the research for people of color. And so that's why I started Our Genetic Legacy, is for us to find our lost ancestral legacies, because our story does not begin or end in enslavement. And we are not included in the history books in any way. So I have a current workshop that we are beta testing, where we're actually writing new history books. So we're teaching the participants legacy tracing, which includes the DNA and traditional research. And then we are now writing those stories for a history book that we will be publishing by the end of this year. And that's what we want to continue to do with that particular workshop, is to continue to write history books so that we can start to diversify the American storyline. And our tagline is correcting his story to include our story. So that's what all of our projects entail, just ways to continue to find our lost histories.
Awesome, thank you. So a little bit kind of related to that, how do we grasp our roots beyond just the DNA?
In terms of doing the research, so the DNA, oftentimes with people of color, we don't have the traditional records that many other ethnicities, European ethnicities have. So we have to oftentimes go through a white relative to find the rest of our story. We also have to engage in conversation with any family members that are still alive. We actually have to go to these places that we have found our family, that we know where our families lived, to find the documents and the information in order to fill in those gaps. So that's where the DNA is necessary, but so is the traditional research, and it just requires a much different level of effort for people of color than it does for others.
Well, one thing that I'm also curious to know, or I can give my observation, is navigating family conversation is often very fragile and difficult to do. So if it's difficult to talk to family members and then you put on top of that family history and there's already dynamics that are in place, just navigating that can just be a weird intersection that can be uncomfortable, that some people might, stray from. So, what are some things that come up that you might notice in terms of some family dynamics that might come up with genealogy, in terms of how people might tell you how they ask questions and, any pushback that they might receive?
So what I have noticed with a lot of my participants is that in doing it in the context of the workshop allows for conversations to take place on more of an academic level, so that sometimes they're able to have conversations that they may not have been able to have otherwise because of the emotion that was attached to it. And it doesn't change the fact that some of the information that we have found out just in, doing this workshop has not been life altering, or, where the DNA oftentimes can change what you thought your family was. It's not uncommon to take the DNA test and find out that your father's not your father, or maybe your father's father is not his father. And then at times it's difficult to figure out how to continue to move forward with the research because of the emotional implications. And that was one of the things that why I wanted to participate in this forum, is because family history and family dynamics, when you start adding in the extras of the genealogy and the facts, when the facts don't line up with the oral stories that your family has shared with you, how do you navigate through that? And that was one of the reasons I say I wanted to do this. And so what do you suggest, Anjail, like in terms of dealing with that?
And so when it comes to understanding family dynamics, you have to look at families as a system, because that's essentially what it is. And then depending on the relationship inside that system, you're looking at smaller subsystems. So the larger context of your family can look like the extended family, but the subsystems could be the relationship you have with your mom, the relationship you have with your siblings, and all those things break down. Your subsystems influence the larger system of your family. So understanding the dynamic of systems and how families tend to work and how the subsystems might influence the impact of family overall. And then another important piece is to also just simply acknowledge the emotional attachment to the work that you're doing. And so often, we want to, acknowledge it in these simple forms and, well, it's good work. I feel great about doing this. That's why I'm moving in the direction. But when it comes to finding things that might be not what you thought it was going to be, to allow you to pivot in different directions, or flat out finding things that are just unpleasant, and you might need to share that with another relative. And the relative that you need to share that with is somebody that has a dynamic. As long as you keep it light with us, things are good between us. When you take it in a left direction and address things that are more difficult to process, it's a conflict. And then you might have additional information that could significantly impact that. So there's a couple of things with just acknowledging the level of awareness with the impact of research. It does require emotional heavy lifting at times. And then also noticing that the information and the emotional attachment and the impact that has on us as individuals, and how we manage those things and how we can bring that to the conversation to try to make it as constructive as it can be, but also having our own expectations in check as well. Because we all want to approach family conversations and we have a picture in our mind about the outcome and how we would like it to play out. And we need to challenge that expectation to say, well, it would be nice if everybody was receptive to what I had to say, but the reality is they might not be. And so somewhere in between the expectation and the reality, in terms of, well, in between that, how do I feel? And what am I bringing to the table? And then depending on who you're talking to, even offering that level of transparency, what I'm going to say, impacted me in this way. Here are the emotions that I struggle with. Now, me talking to you about it is sharing information. I'm responsible for my emotions, but I'm telling you that as a degree of transparency and vulnerability to try to establish some level of connection. And all you can do is just do your best in those conversations, but acknowledging that it does require heavy lifting for you internally. And then being able to understand the expectations and the reality of how things could possibly go. And simply just trying to do your best in those conversations with trying to connect and offer a level of transparency for yourself in order to navigate through the more objective context of the conversation.
I was actually very interested in what you were just speaking on, Anjail, talking about navigating the information that you're getting. I wonder if you could talk about navigating asking for that information, or like having that conversation of, I want to know more about this person or that person, or maybe there's a part of my family history that I don't know. And as the researcher, you may not realize that you're broaching on some sensitive areas. How would the transparency also be here, where you're just saying, this is what my intentions are?
Can you give me an example, whether it's hypothetical or real life example?
Sure. So I'll use a real life example. I did not know the first name of one of my grandfathers. So it was making it a little difficult to find those connections because I didn't know his first name. And I knew a little bit of background of that he wasn't really in the family anymore. But I wasn't sure how to navigate that conversation of, I need a birthday and a first name to be able to figure this information out to keep the family tree going. So I personally wouldn't know how to handle that situation.
If you don't mind me asking, who is the person that you would have to ask that question to? Is it one person? Is it several people?
It would be one person.
Okay. And what is the relationship like with that person when you talk to them about family topics?
It depends on what part of the family. So it depends on which area of the family. This certain person we've basically never talked about. So this would be a brand new conversation that would be being had.
Mm-hmm. And so what is your emotional reaction as you notice that here's something that I want to have more information about, but I haven't taken that step yet? Like noticing yourself not taking that step with that family member, or even just having the language to say it. How does that make you feel?
Mostly curious, but I am in the role of the researcher. I don't have that emotional baggage with that person. Mm-hmm. So I also have the knowledge of knowing this person may not want to have that conversation. So maybe just knowing that my role is just researcher and not having that background. And maybe I go to the person and have the conversation, but it doesn't go well. That's okay. Mm-hmm. It's okay to not get that information.
And so there there are a couple of things that could possibly be inside of that conversation, because I think when taking on the role as somebody as the researcher in that context, it definitely creates more of an objective space to be able to separate the emotion, to be able to go ahead and ask the question. But what we're seeing is that the question still isn't being asked and there's hesitation there. And so on the outside looking in that researcher role, I would think that it can create some distance to be able to ask the tough questions, because you have that distance there. So it can be easy to say, do you know his name? But with talking to that particular person, even just giving a prerequisite in terms of just like, there's something that I want to talk about, but it makes me curious, but I'm wondering if we discuss it a little bit, maybe we can probably mitigate some of the outcomes. So even if it's just some level of pre-conversation before asking the question to kind of take the steam out of it a little bit for you. But before even asking the question, with that other person, just acknowledging the emotions that is attached for you. So there are some emotions that are attached in terms of the researcher aspect of what you're doing, which is the curious part, but you're still a person doing that research. And when you try to step behind just the researcher role, you're not integrating who you are as a person that's also behind it. And that can be a convenient thing to do, but it can also create a space of desensitizing you at the same time and creating a space of numbness, especially if you, depending on how far you want to go with the research. So you want to try to integrate, the researcher aspect to definitely push through these questions, but in order to make sure that you're not discounting the gravity of those situations, you also want to check in to say, what other emotions are there for me? How can I possibly tend to those emotions prior to that conversation? And even when I'm in that conversation with that person, I can't control how they respond. Some people would like to, but we can't. And so the best we can do is just try to say, there's something that I want to ask you, and it could cause some discomfort, but we're welcome to stop at any point. You let me know, but here's what I want to ask, different things like that.
I have a question on it seems like you're anticipating before asking the question. So you've never had the conversation before, but it's almost like you already know it's a problem, or what indicators have you had that it's going to be an issue? Is it just the fact that he hasn't been talked about?
I think that's mostly it, is like, in this side of my family, we're very close, very conversational, and, having that void, you kind of fill in information and use kind of your background of knowing, okay, this is probably a space that doesn't want or doesn't need to be talked about, or may have some negative emotions, stuff like that. And other people may find that whenever they're starting their genealogy, or when they get to a part in their genealogy to where they're like, never thought about this part. Mm-hmm. They may be finding these little gaps in the family history.
But what I also notice is you talking about the general observation of how that family typically handles information, and then the emotion that you notice of how it influences everybody. And I'm wondering if you asking that question possibly pushes back against the subsystem that's happening between you and that other person, just with the influence of information there.
Yeah, it's very possible. And it could be me bringing my own baggage to the conversation, to where I should just have it and just see what happens.
And it's okay, because, when we say baggage, it comes with a lot of negative associations and stuff like that, but that's where we need to unpack in order to get to the healing. So, but we want to make sure that, we're not bringing all of our luggage in that conversation, because then it sets us up to think that they're supposed to unpack it with me. They can't do that. They might have their own baggage too, and they don't even know, they don't want to acknowledge that it's in the corner. And so the level of awareness that you have to say, it could be me. I could be bringing extra stuff here that might not need to be in that conversation, and that's okay. The acknowledgement of that is definitely okay, and it's normal. But what you want to do is, before you go into that conversation, acknowledge what the baggage could be to the best of your ability on your own, and then to try to figure out what are those areas that you might want to unpack that could influence that conversation. And even if you're not able, because that's still a lot of heavy digging that might require additional supports there, but acknowledging the space of like, that might influence the relationship I have with that person. I like the relationship and where it is. If I ask that question, it makes it uncomfortable, it might not be the same, anything in that example. And so addressing that for what it is separately, and then creating a certain level of balance and peace with it for the moment, and then being able to say, okay, so now that I have clarity on where my space is, I can go in that conversation, and then I can challenge my own expectations and manage my own baggage over here that's separate, and understand that. So, because sometimes, unfortunately, depending on the family or who you're talking to, they might try to use that as a way of getting out of what you're asking or get out of the conversation, and to not make it about them, or if they're uncomfortable, all these different things. And you might see that come up as, as a tool to basically, well, I don't want to answer that question. You're just answering that question because X, Y, and Z. And it's just like, well, no, I'm asking this question because it's something I genuinely want to know. Now we can stop, we don't have to, and create the options of how the conversation can go for you and for them to not be confrontational.
Yeah, I think all of that is very, very insightful and something that I will take away from this. So thank you.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Shellie.
And speaking of that as well, I feel what I've noticed in my projects is that when there's a goal that you're trying to achieve, that's, like we're talking about, and you're in that researcher mind space and you're not necessarily dealing with the emotional, I feel that oftentimes that gives space to ask questions that you might not normally, and there'll be emotion that will come, but it's like you don't have time to process it necessarily immediately, because now it's just a matter of like, I need to know this for this particular purpose, and I have this timeline. And then it's that after of the processing of the emotion after the information has been, determined, or you meet with someone who is resistant to sharing that information. As the researcher, then you kind of figure out like, okay, now I know for sure this is a problem. And, let me figure out if there's another way to get that information. I was at a genealogy conference a couple of weeks ago online, and they were saying that the primary thing should be do no harm. And so sometimes that just means walking away from it. If it's just too much for a person to deal with, there's always other ways to find out information. And so that's why I was saying, like, the combination of the DNA and the records and doing that deep digging, you don't always have to, sometimes easier to go through a relative because they have the answer. But if it's too much for them and you still want that answer, then that just increases, your workload in terms of how to go about getting that information without disturbing their peace.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Broadly, what are some of the potential impacts when researching one's genealogy on mental health? I know we kind of touched on it, where it may impact that personal relationship, but what about mental health and the process have you seen in your time?
I think one of the biggest things that I have noticed is the redefinition of self, and realizing that who you thought you were, you might not be, and how to contextualize that, how to, navigate through that, and realize, you're still you, and even though you're learning some facts that you may or may not have been aware of. And we're always, I think Anjail was saying, we're always in a constant state of change and evolution. So identity is not a static thing. And so, you figure out the parts that work for you and the parts that don't, you just kind of figure out how to maneuver around them. And that's what I've noticed a lot in my workshops that I'm currently conducting with people, finding out things that they may or may not have known before.
One of the things I also find interesting that could be just a piece to chew on for people is just life is about change, it's about growth, but what is your relationship to change? And I can only imagine, as someone who does, with genealogy and research like you guys are doing, you're seeing things change constantly in documents. And so if you're somebody that struggles with change on another sphere and then you jump into genealogy, whatever the emotional attachment you have to change is going to pop up somewhere else. And so it's important to self-evaluate first. I understand change in this context, but what is my reaction to change? Am I typically frustrated when something changes? Am I angry when I notice something is out of order? Does it make me curious to be able to investigate how things are changing and moving and evolving? So the emotional attachment that we tend to have with change is going to be different for every individual. And I think it's important to start with the self, especially if you're talking about doing the work of genealogy, because you might have a story of how your family came to be one way, and then there's going to be evidence presented that either could complement the story or could be completely opposite of that. And then, as you're going through paperwork, filing through those things, it might be easy to detach or almost remove the emotional piece of it in order to get through the work. But even after you close the books that you're going through in the research, you still have to be a person at the end of the day and articulate the research. And in order to not desensitize yourself from that or become numb in a sense, you want to try to integrate, well, what is my relationship to the emotional attachment of what I'm doing? Is it a space of excitement? Is it a space of joy? Is it a space of uncertainty? Does it push on the other things that I need to work on? And that could be a space of change. If I like things a certain way in my life and I'm doing this research and it pushes on all these other things, or if I'm not coming up with the answers that I want in a certain timeline, that could trigger some things that might come up in genealogy if you're working with a team or if it's just with you. And then those things echo in different places in your life. So, I mean, it's one thing that we tend to talk about change and these large concepts, but our emotional attachment to them plays out in all these different ways. So starting with the self in terms of what is your emotional response to change typically, and then being able to understand how that too is also evolving as well as you continue.
And a follow-up question, quite related, is what do you do when you become a proxy or an outlet for someone else's trauma while they're researching?
So what tends to happen is indirect trauma tends to happen. So with a lot of families, with some African-American families, we share a lot of oral stories in terms of what we remember, what we can recall, with people in our family that we may remember, whether it's a great grandmother, et cetera. So depending on the story, you might experience some indirect trauma or vicarious trauma, which with listening to the story, it can feel as though you're in the person and place situation, almost like first person as the person telling the story. And that can also weigh on you as if the story is happening to you. You also see vicarious trauma play out in other professions as well, where you have other helping professionals that have to be with other people in intense crisis. So if I'm somebody that's recalling a story that might have happened 30 years ago, where it was an extreme crisis of something very violent happening to my family, but I want you to know the story because it asks the overall family history, depending on the details of how I articulate that story, it might cause some vicarious trauma there. So as the listener, listening is a big deal. Listening isn't just you being quiet and just sitting there. You're absorbing the information, you're deciding what you want to process, and you're figuring out how you want to use that information for yourself to add to your learning process. But listening is not just a small thing, because depending on how we listen and internalize information, it can cause a level of vicarious trauma depending on the story that's being told.
That is very true. Thank you. So in that regard, when you're finding these injustices in your family history, or if you're finding some type of injustice in your family history, how do you cope and how do you process that?
From a non-clinical standpoint, the way that I guess this speaks to what Anjail was saying in terms of how your general outlook on life and the things that you're comfortable with and how you normally deal with situations will be reflected in how you deal with the research. And I am, when I'm doing research and I find negative things, I don't dwell on them in their negative impact. I think of them, I compartmentalize them in a way of, but I'm still here. So yes, that happened. Yes, it was horrible, but I'm here. And because even though that happened, I still survived. And, that person went through that so that I could be here. So it gives me a greater sense of responsibility to honor that sacrifice. And that's just the way that I deal with it. I know that everybody's different, but that's how I deal with it.
So Shellie, it sounds like, if I can use what you said as an example, it sounds like you do two things that stood out to me. You use positive reframing in terms of understanding the story for what it is, but then the positive reframe is I'm here, and through that experience, it allows me to do what I'm doing professionally, to be able to have an impact. So the positive reframe for you is helpful in that. And then there was another piece to that you were also mentioning, but the positive reframe is the piece that stood out that I find that was interesting as a part of that.
And I've noticed when dealing, because I think when we were speaking earlier this week, I have a it is what it is type mentality about a lot of things. That some things you just can't change, they just are.
Yeah.
So getting worked up about, or for me, I try not to focus on things that I can't change. And I certainly can't change the past. So I can learn the lessons from it, but then I have to move forward. And that's kind of way that I teach when I teach genealogy, how I teach it. While I'm teaching it, it has worked so far in terms of redirecting, but I don't know what the aftermath will be. Because when you're if that's not your natural way of doing things, and you're kind of doing it because you're following my guide, when we end our research time, I don't know how that will affect people long term. I have not been able to deal with that. And so that's kind of where Anjail comes in with the long-term individual work outside of the project. And so one of the things that I want to do in future is to have a list of resources for people for, continuing emotional work that might be dredged up as a result of doing the genealogy work, that, stick a little harder, or, make a little things more uncomfortable. And it's not going away with just the success of knowing the story, that there's still, it touches on other things that you need to deal with individually that are outside of the story.
Shellie,
one of the things that, if I can just comment real quick, one of the things that we were saying earlier when we talked, and it kind of speaks to a little bit of what you were saying, because when you're teaching the classes of how to train someone else to do genealogy, you're only with them for a limited amount of time. So you're not walking them through the process on a day-to-day basis, but you're giving them the tools. But when you see them, just with that conversation, you're not sure what comes up for people if they don't tell you. But through talking about the strategies that you use, it's that first aid kit. And, it's there to give you the Band-Aid, the alcohol swab, the gauze and stuff like that, but it's not meant to do the deep digging. It's not meant to stop the bleeding, but it is there to help to gain some perspective. So even when you share your positive reframe of like, well, I'm here and doing the work gives me a sense of satisfaction, even that's helpful because you're sharing what works for you. You're not recommending it, but you are saying that the positive reframe is a step in the direction of the healing process to cope and to still move forward in that. And just by using yourself in an example in that limited time frame way gives that perspective to someone else. Okay, well, maybe there's a positive reframe for me when I see uncomfortable information. So it doesn't necessarily have to be tied in to the doing part. It's definitely that too. But sometimes for people, we can't get to the coping aspect of what can we do before we cope mentally, what's going on cognitively for us, as we're seeing things come across, as we might feel like we're re-experiencing some things, as they tend to linger a little bit. How do we deal with those images that, is real for me, but not real for you because it's not happening to you. And I might feel uncomfortable sharing that information with you. So the positive reframe is also definitely good as well. But even with just simple grounding techniques, depending on how you respond to some of the information that's happening to you, even if it's just engaging, sight, sound, smell, things like that, in order to bring you back to the center and the reality of where you are, to be able to engage in the positive reframe as the next step, to just know that I'm okay. I'm doing the work. This work adds to the story of who I am, which adds to the larger collective of who our family is, and influencing the family system to be more functional, and how I play an impactful part in that. So all of those things are important, but we also have to acknowledge the limitation in that, right? Because you're not going to be doing the same heavy lifting as somebody that's taking from your course and going to apply that. But you're speaking to acknowledge that I understand that there's some emotional heavy lifting that you're going to do. Here's how I cope with it on a daily basis.
And Shellie, have you had a situation or a scenario where that has come up, where there's been some type of mental health component that has come up?
I've had situations where so one example is that I have one participant who's African American, did her DNA, realized that she has, European blood. That's something that I kind of like take as a given. Mm-hmm. And even though she, accomplished academics, she understands, how the whole system of enslavement worked, but she still thought she was going to be different. So when she got her test results, and she had trouble moving forward to do the research, and she had to detach to a degree. Instead of trying to trace particular people, she chose to start tracing the last name, because that was something that she could deal with. And when I was speaking with Anjail earlier in the week in preparation, she was asking me to, to ask her, what was it about having that, European blood that, bothered her so? And I did speak with her, and she said, because she doesn't get any of the privilege, so what's the point? And it was not the answer I was expecting. I thought she was going to say, because then that just means that, one of my ancestors that, I'm picturing, a typical story of enslavement with, without finding the exact details. So that typically, is a non-consensual relationship. And so I thought that that was her issue, but she said that no, she doesn't get the point of having, and I think she's only 9%, so it's not even a significant percentage, but just the fact that it's there. And she's like, I don't get 9% of white privilege. So I have the blood, but there's no benefit to me. And I was like, I really wasn't expecting that answer. Like, it threw me. So Anjail, now you have the answer. What do you think?
Well, there are a lot of different directions that conversation can take. And not to mislead the context of this conversation is not meant to therapeutically guide anybody or to give a concrete answer in that regard. But I can give insight in reference to what I hear from that story, because that's a very, that's a heavy answer to say, well, I don't get any of the privilege, so what do I care? But that 9% makes you who you are, for better or for worse, and we all, as Black people, we always understand, because of how we came through, with the relationship with slavery, there's probably some percentage, and it is what it is. It doesn't mean I'm less Black. It's going to be there. So it's not a surprise. And it sounds like she knew it wasn't a surprise. It's just she was hung up in the percentage and the number.
She was hoping to not have it. So even though she knew that there was the possibility, the actuality of it was, now it kind of burst her own perception of herself, or what she wanted to portray in terms of being Black. She wanted to be 100%, and that's kind of how she lives her life. And so this, small percentage, it just irritates her. She says she's like, to this day, she's like, it irritates me, because it serves no purpose. And she's like, I would want to be 100%. So she just has chosen, like I say, to focus on the last name. And even though the last name has traversed around the world, it did not begin in America or even, in Black.
But if it was 100%, she wouldn't be who she is. Like
exactly.
Her story wouldn't be like, she wouldn't have been able to have you to talk to. She would, who knows if she would be in a different country. So it's like, I understand, because the emotion there that she's speaking to under all that is irritation. She's irritated. That's okay to be irritated. She's probably not the only one that's done a DNA test and been irritated with the results that she's come back with.
Right.
It's perfectly normal. But we do have to reframe a little bit and to pull back to understand, if she were to be the expectation of what she thought she was going to be in terms of number-wise, 100% African or whatever the breakdown she was looking for, then she wouldn't know you. She wouldn't exist under the name that she has. She wouldn't have the family that she has. So I get the emotional attachment there, but if she had what she wanted, then everything else, her whole life would not be what it is right now. And I'm pretty sure there's a lot in her life that she's really grateful for and happy to have, but you stop looking at that once you hone in on the smaller thing, instead of pulling back to know how all of these smaller things add up to the larger picture of who you are.
And I believe that she has done that in terms of the moving forward. And it's funny that you say that, because that's how I feel when, my whole "it is what it is" attitude. Because yes, if this was different, then you wouldn't be you. If that hadn't happened, then this wouldn't have happened. It's just all these interconnected events. But I think that the real mental health issue comes about when you don't want to be who you are. So when you're learning,
what she said?
No. I'm not even speaking to her specifically. I'm just saying generalization of a person where that technique doesn't work. Because to say like, oh, you're not, you wouldn't be who you are, you wouldn't have met, me, you wouldn't be in this project. Some people want a different life. And so how do you deal with
Is that what she was saying?
No.
Just in general?
Totally unrelated to her. I'm saying she's navigated. I feel that she's navigating. But there may be people who have that same type of situation, because you're saying there's others who have, find out things in their ancestry, whether it be through the DNA or through the genealogy research, and they can't figure out how to navigate past it because they focus on the what if. If that hadn't happened, then I might, be this person, and I would rather be that person than who I am. Am I making sense?
But when you do the what ifs, in my mind, it kind of robs you from the gratitude of what you have.
I agree.
And so it's like, it makes sense for people to kind of do that in reference to family research, I would think. And even if even if they feel like they need to kind of, that's their way of processing, because it could be. Everybody's way of processing emotions in that outlet is going to be different. So you might find somebody that does the what if thing and it just keeps going and going. But when that tends to happen, it also stagnates the conversation to go forward, and it just kind of loops itself, onto itself. And so there's validity in the what ifs, but in order to progress forward as an individual doing the research, I would think, what is the gratitude in the information? What is the gratitude in the story of the family? Where is the benefit and the meaning, overall meaning, and what you're finding in the process of what you're doing? Because that brings you back into the here and now. It creates a space to honor the what ifs, but you also need to honor the here and now and where you are in order to figure out what direction you want to go. Now, that might be too much heavy lifting if you're working with somebody like that. And so my suggestion would be, when they start to go to the what ifs, or, my expectation was this and stuff like that, I would want to know, like, what is that emotion attached to all of that? Because like with the other story, with the other lady you were talking about, it was irritation for her. And with that, to keep it on a first aid kit level, you can connect to that emotion in some other form to where it's just like, so the emotion is irritation. I get that. Here's how I get irritated with this stuff. You know, I can share my story with that. But here's also how I deal with it too, because when I get irritated, I know I can't stay in that space for a long period of time. But when I acknowledge it, when I label it, I'm able to cut through it, because here's what I do in order to cope with it. So you connect with the emotion that's the underlying emotion with how they're sharing. You can choose to relate to it with your own story and then offer what you do in order to cope with that emotion. And then you can move on to the, it is what it is.
Okay.
You can close it with that.
Just as a part of a side, people don't know, like when we were talking the other day in preparation for this, and I was telling her my is what it is attitude, she was like, you might not want to lead with that. So that's where that comes from.
Because you're over here saying it is what it is, and then they're still doing the what ifs. So it's two separate conversations happening, and we want to bring that conversation back to the center where it can be together. Because it can feel, you know, sometimes when we have conversations and we're having an emotional reaction, it on the surface, it can feel like we're talking, but it's not talking. Because I'm thinking about the what ifs and oh my gosh, and da, 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 I'm obsessing. And then you're like, it is what it is. This is what the paperwork says. So you good? You good over there? And it's like, and that's okay, but that might need to be the closer. The opener could be, what's the emotion? Because you keep going over this thing, but are you frustrated? Are you angry? What is that? Well, I'm angry. I get that. I'm angry, and that makes complete sense. Let me tell you how I was angry with some of the things that I've researched. Can I share that with you? Okay, because this made me upset. You know, we're sharing, we're back to talking, we're hopefully that person has stopped obsessing and they've chosen to listen to you. So that kind of refocuses them a little bit. And then you can kind of guide the conversation to say, okay, so now that we acknowledge that there's anger that comes up in this research that we're doing, it is what it is, because that's a part of the labor of what we're doing. Right. And I understand it's a part of the labor of what we're doing, and this is what I do. So
I definitely receive and appreciate that technique, because that will help me to navigate in the future. I say we've been successful so far, but we're just getting started. So I definitely appreciate that insight and direction on how to manage it in the future if it becomes a situation that is not easily navigatable as the one that I've dealt with thus far. So I definitely appreciate that.
A little bit of follow-up to this conversation of delving into stuff that maybe you don't anticipate that you find. What about those that want to get into genealogy and want to find out their family history, but may be afraid to stir something up, or maybe kind of afraid of that unknown element?
There are a lot of people who do the research privately. It's just not, they don't publicize it within their family. I've worked with a lot of individuals before I started OGL, where they would be in groups and would specifically say, you know, come up with like, well, ask your so-and-so. Like, well, no, they don't know I'm doing this and I don't want them to know. This is for me. And so that I have seen happen on multiple occasions, where whether it be because of race, whether it be because of family dynamic relationships in terms of children, you know, may or may not be biological, not wanting to hurt the parent that's, you know, in the home who has raised them, but wanting to find biological family, you know, and oftentimes the way that that is navigated around would be issues of health, because that's, you know, that's a life impacting thing that, you know, oftentimes people use that when they're saying, you know, I want to know my family's health history, that will allow the, you know, in-home parent to be okay with that research or participating in that level of work, because it's not about the emotional, it's about life. So that is one way that I've seen a lot of people work around it, in addition to just, you know, say, just doing it privately, just, you know, doing their DNA because the DNA is in them, and just doing the work, and depending on the availability of research to compare it against. Because one of the big things, like with Ancestry, what their marketing doesn't tell you is that it's based on comparison to other people who have tested. So it's not enough for you to take a test and then you're going to suddenly find all these cousins and know exactly where they fit. If somebody on a particular line that you are looking for has not tested, or you can't figure out which of your DNA matches are on that line, you're gonna hit a wall. You have to do that work to try to figure it out. And so that's why your closer cousin matches, how we're able to determine a lot of, like paternity issues. If you take a DNA test and you have a bunch of, first and second cousins, and they have trees on there, and you're looking at their trees, but you don't recognize any of the names. Now, these are people that you should share, grandparents, aunts and uncles with, and they're tracing back to their third great grands on both sides, and you don't see any of, your known surnames there. That's the indicator that your parent, what you thought is not true biologically, and gives you that, those, you have to do those comparisons and do that work. So genealogy is a collaborative sport. It requires, and it's definitely sport. It's, it's a lot of work. I'll talk about, heavy lifting. So there's the emotional, there's the research side of it. So it's a lot of work that needs to take place for it to be done well and done correctly, because that's the biggest issue, is correctly.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like when you can only do the work based on what you can find. And then, you have your analysis of the information that you're able to find, and you come to your best conclusions. Like one of the things we're doing with the history books that we're writing is that all of the evidence that we have found will be included with the chapter that the person writes. So that way, if something happens, technology, in 10 years, more, documents become available, the progress of DNA and how to do those matches changes. It may change the conclusion that you come to, but this is how you came to that conclusion, and this is the evidence that I used to come to that conclusion, so that it's got solid foundation. But as we all know, with just everything that happens in life scientifically or any other kind of way, that over time things change, and more opportunities and information may become available that will change your story. So this is best guess right now. Like sometimes I wonder, with Alex Haley and Roots, like I wonder how that would change now with the use of DNA.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as I know, that hasn't been done. I don't even know if it can be at this point, because it would be descendants and it might be too far off. But I would just be curious, and that's like a prime example of where the added technology might change the story.
So this question, still kind of in the same ballpark. It's a two-part question for each of you. So for Shellie, can you get desensitized while doing genealogy? And then the follow-up for Anjail, how do you recognize this desensitization if you do get it?
You definitely become you can't, because it's the pursuit of the information becomes the objective. And you're not necessarily thinking about the emotional impact to either, yourself or others. You just, you're strictly focused on finding the information. And I think that is a large part of the foundation of doing the genealogical work. And when I talk about legacy and the positivity and, the debt I feel to pay homage to my ancestors, that's the emotional part. But you got to get through step A to get through to B. And sometimes B, being that emotion, will block your progress. And so I'd be curious with Anjail, like how you would address that, because you guys know I'm the it is what it is person.
You shut that down when you say that. You're like, no, we don't have time for you, emotion. You do not exist.
That was a whole other story. We're not gonna know that one.
And so, yeah, I think you can get desensitized to anything that involves working with a human being, whether it's paperwork, whether it's a helping profession, whether it's just family members. If you can get desensitized to it by not acknowledging it in the first place, by making something else a more important objective, or even by acknowledging it for a limited period of time and just say, oh, that's too scary, so we're just not going to go back there. So it's a lot of different things that can typically happen. But one of the things that I also wanted to speak to is that these are people behind the paperwork. And when you're doing the genealogy, I would think by the time you're asking questions about names, you could be asking a question about a name that hasn't been spoken in 50 years. Depending on how the family metabolizes information of a person, some families, they allow people to completely disappear in regards to storytelling. So there might be family members that you might not even know their name, but the minute you start doing research, the minute you say that name, you bring that back to life. And when you say that name, there's an emotional impact there, whether you like it or not. And if the person chooses to acknowledge it or stuff it down, it's an impact there. And that's one thing that we don't want to just forget, because it can easily be kind of extracted, like, it doesn't have to exist and it doesn't have to exist right now. But if you're looking at death records day in and day out, there has to be some level of numbness that could come there, because you're looking at how someone passed away, and you could be looking at 5 or 10 different records like that on any given day. And so if you don't acknowledge the emotional relationship that you might have to what you're doing, the people behind these records, it definitely creates a desensitization when it comes to that. And in order to avoid that, you want to create some level of boundaries for yourself that's separate from the research, I would think, in order to allow yourself to connect emotionally to what you're doing and create some level of boundary for it by the time you have to step into that research. Because depending on other contextual things, whether there's a timeline involved, whether it's a team of people involved, whether it's an intense conversation that needs to happen, you can step into those things knowing that prior to you doing the research or after you putting the research away, you coming back to the center with yourself and saying, that was tough work. I looked at a death record of somebody that was lynched, and so I don't know how to process that, or I don't want to process that because it's uncomfortable for me. Just, simple things of the self-awareness and the self-reflection and the boundaries around how that happens for you. Now, typically, some of those conversations can come up through journaling. They can come up through your self-care. They can come up through other different ways that we funnel our emotions, but we have to experience our emotions, because if we don't, it's going to come out in some other unpredictable way. And it could be uncontrollable by that time, or it could be completely out of context where it's like, what are you talking about? We're talking about this. So in order to have some level of self-preservation, but create some level of boundary, you want to try to create some space where you're acknowledging the emotional attachment to what you're doing prior to you having to step into the intensity of what you're doing. And then in order to be able to navigate through it without neglecting yourself and the emotional need that's there.
Thanks. I would have a question, because I do feel that I probably have done that to a great degree, just because, like, you actually as a genealogist, you get excited when you find a death record. You get excited, like all your records, like you're excited because there's so much information in those records,
right,
that you need to go further. If you get one that shows, who the mother, who the father was, birth dates, occupation, whether
but just in that brief moment where you said, as a researcher, I get excited when I find a death record. Yeah. Like, if you were to say that outside of this context, what does that sound like? Right. And so it's like on your end, it's like the information piece, because it closes up all these holes, everywhere, which completely makes sense, right? But it's just like, in any other context, if you found a death record and it was outside of research, would that be a pleasant experience?
Right. No, it would not. More likely than not, it be a reality, but not necessarily something that.
And sometimes, like, just the minimal acknowledgement of that, without, you don't have to go all the way deep into it and do the heavy digging, but just acknowledging, like, outside of the research context, finding a death record would be a terrible thing to read. The acknowledgement of that could be enough. And then being able to go back to the space, now I can go ahead and fill in the blanks with a lot of this stuff. I can get through it. And I'm not, but when you prioritize your emotions in a certain space with some separation there, it prioritizes yourself. And you have to make a space to prioritize yourself no matter what, especially when you're doing a lot of heavy emotional lifting when it comes to just finding information, or even if you have to talk about that information to the family that you're researching about.
So there was a question. What are the positive mental health benefits of doing this kind of research, or is it just all heavy and sad?
Definitely not. Like I say, when I spoke earlier about the legacy and the survival in spite of those, that's where I focus, is on that positive aspect. And so that's why when I'm doing the research, I don't become consumed by what was done to my ancestors in that way, because I feel that to me it shows their extreme strength, because in spite of all of that, I'm here. So that's the success in that, the road, although it's not ideal, it's not the way that we would want it, but it is what it is. And it wasn't the end. It's like, I say, like, our reality, our legacies don't begin and end in slavery. That was a part of it. But the resilience, the strength that had to exist, just to survive the Middle Passage. Let's just start there. Just to make it to America in the first place. And so when I get caught up in my own individual, problems today, and then I think about my ancestors and what they had to deal with, it gives me strength to know that, oh, I got this, because as bad as it might feel because I'm in it, I know they had to go through so much more, and they persevered, and that is, their gift to me and my gift to them.
And when you share your story, it makes me think about, the things that are going on today with a lot of the protests and stuff like that. Are the ability for us to be African American and Black is an expression of our resilience and our resistance. And so that's the things that I think about when it comes to my ancestors, and even coming across like information that might not be pleasant to read or pleasant to research. It's like the expression of how we were able to overcome all of those things, and us to be able to talk about it freely in this format, in an environment, in this current context. It might not be the best context, but it is a different context than the earlier 20th century and things like that. It's an expression of our ability to resist. It's an expression of our ability to be able to overcome and still empower each other and ourselves. And with that is the positive reframe to be able to say there's a lot here to connect to the gratitude of who we are as Black people, as Black women, and we can't overlook that. And it, for me, acknowledging that creates a softer space for me to be able to go ahead and engage in the harder stuff that might be more objective, that might be a little bit more cold to go through, because I have everything that I need in order to get to where I need to go. And for whatever I don't have, the flexibility and the stretching and the learning part is what I'm willing to incorporate. But I couldn't have any of that, if it wasn't for someone being courageous enough to withstand, maltreatment and things like that in the past. So I definitely agree. But it's just like our Blackness is an expression of all of those things that make us resilient to where we are today.
And Anjail, whenever I was giving your introduction, I was talking about your work in the foster care system. Do you have any thoughts about like the gaining of information, especially for people that maybe don't know about themselves all that much, and how that can be positive, where you're kind of learning this background that maybe you don't understand or know, or have a easier way to find out? Like, I have people I could ask, but other people may not.
And so the context of me working in foster care systems. So for instance, I was at an agency where it was a third party agency that would work with foster care children in reunification process with temporary placement or permanent placement. And then also working with the parents for reunification if that was in place for the child. And unfortunately, a lot of the information, by the time you're talking to the parent, if they have an opportunity to lie, they're going to lie to you, and they're not going to be honest with you. They're going to avoid, drug testing, whatever they can, unfortunately. And so that diminishes the opportunity for the parent to reunify with the child. And that's all the child wants. They need to understand where they are. And then they see their environment constantly changing. And they have people like myself coming in there trying to encourage them to have a positive attitude about that, which can be difficult for a child that's adjusting to all these traumatic events back to back to back. And so, from a social work perspective, we have to encounter information and truth telling all the time, because unfortunately, you don't get people that'll tell the truth, unfortunately, and you still have to be able to insert different strategies for them to still persevere in the environments that they're in and as they change. And so those are transferable skills to understand loosely on the outside looking in of, on a field like genealogy, because there's still a space where you're still looking for truth, and still looking to connect the dots and resources and how family can be a resource. And when they're not resourceful, how can you still pursue outside of that? And so one of the things that's just kind of interesting is, being able to be on that journey of finding information when people don't want to talk to you. And, when there's a lot of attitudes surrounding, the presence of you just being there and the purpose of why you're there, collecting information and the emotional response that comes up for that. And so, even on the end of a social worker, there's still work that we have to do to make sure that we're objective in that space. But on that end, you still have to coach someone else in that space too, to say, here's how you can understand your environment as it's constantly moving. And it's okay to be upset by that. And we don't want to overlook that as though the negative emotions don't have a place to exist. They do have a place to exist. You have a place to speak to them and talk about them, but we want to make sure that we understand how you're acting on them. Because a lot of times, we can negatively act out on them in reference to wanting to fight people, cuss people out, and all these different things. And it's like, you can do that, but is that the most productive thing to do? Is that the most beneficial thing for you to do? And how does that benefit you in the long run? Do you want to spend the next 6 months regretting that decision? And if you don't, how do we move forward with that? So one of the things that we typically do in the field is just make it very person-centered, in reference to, in order to navigate how things are, to understand change and how that relates to the family dynamic and how that relates to their own self-growth, and still allowing them to navigate that and us assisting on that path in that way.
Awesome, thank you. This one's for Shellie. What has been your greatest success when doing genealogy research, either personally or for somebody else?
The greatest success. I guess I would relate to one that's personal. No, I'll tell another one. So I have a friend who both of her parents were adopted. And she only knew one side of her mother's maternal side was the only side that she knew. And so that was 5-6 years ago. And I was like, I know genealogy. So look, I'm going to give you a DNA test. We're going to DNA test. And as a result, we have been able to find all sides of her family. From her parents, biological parents on both sides. And just the overwhelming gratitude that she had of having that information. Because up to that point, she's like, whenever her kids had to do family tree projects, she didn't have she had a short list, and then, those were the adopted names. It was all the information that she had for them to be able to share. Where now she can't wait for the next project. In fact, all of her children are participating in the workshop. That they're now writing about their families, both. Some of them are writing about biological, some of them are writing about the adopted side, because that's their full picture and story. But just seeing how much there wasn't and now how much there is, where how much was added to that, and just the impact and the things that, I take for granted in knowing and even having, met many of my grandparents and even my great grandmother, having known her, not really known her, I was 8, but having that experience of her being alive. That's probably one of my biggest accomplishments in terms of this is worthy work.
And Anjail, do you have what is your experience with genealogical research? What have you experienced?
Well, my experience was just talking to my dad in reference to asking questions about, the information about his family and how much he knows. And one of the interesting things that at the time I didn't realize the positive in it, but he was able to recite at least 200 years worth of history just off of the top in reference to what he remembers in terms of his grandparents, great grandparents, and locations of where people were from. And when I shared that with Steve, he was like, that's impressive. Most people can't do that. I was just like, I guess so. And my dad, he's not the one to offer emotions or a whole lot of words. And when he does, it's like, oh, you're talking today. So it's like, you want to latch on. So when we were talking, he wanted to talk about that. I was like, great. And then he was able to recite it back. And I was just like, okay. And with him talking about the history of his family orally in that way, I wanted to go ahead and, type that in a document and just keep track of it, because I know I won't be able to hold all that kind of information in up top. So, that was one of my first introductions to genealogy as well. But just in that brief moment, it's like, I understand who my dad is. And it's just like he and his emotional guard and how he has that always, but it's not like he didn't love and care for us. He loves us very deeply. The way he articulates that is in his own way. And people are just individuals in that way, but also understanding the relationship, the personality traits and how people are, and still navigating conversations anyway, taking that risk. So even within that brief interaction, still acknowledging that there's a lot of different things at play, even though I'm just saying, hey, do you remember who your great grandparents were?
And with that, either one, both, could you talk about kind of the process of getting these sources and gathering this information, and kind of the use of oral history, maybe?
So I'll speak to that. So the process, the way that I have done it personally and how I'm adapting it for the workshops, we call it legacy tracing. So we start with the DNA and the names that you know. We start building that tree. And once you get to certain points, you want to reach out to family members to record those oral histories. And so because we are focusing our work on using primary source documents, I had to teach my participants how to convert an oral story into a primary source document by recording it and writing out the transcription of that oral history, because now you can use that as part of the evidence. It goes beyond just being a story of a conversation that you've heard. Now you have the full context of that conversation, and you can now apply that to what you're writing. And you may or may not, you may find out that some of the information that that person remembers may not be correct. You might find conflicting evidence. And then that's when it's going to become upon you to, analyze and determine what exactly, your conclusion is based on that evidence. And just continuing to gather those sources and to be able to publicize those and preserve them. Like when Anjail was talking about her father could recite 200 years of history. That's amazing. And that's, a gift that he's given to her that she now was astute enough to recognize and to, put that down so that future generations, because a lot of the times that's really what it is. And we just need to know that one name. And then we could, shoot all the way back, in our research. We just can't find this one name. We don't know where to go next because we're now, we're at this wall and we don't know what name to fill in here. So that's a lot of what that entails. It's just doing the work. And sometimes it involves having to go to these places. going to those, going to courthouses. Not everything has been digitized. Not everything is online. I've been to Alabama a couple of times, literally at the courthouse, just going through documents one by one. And I actually found a letter that was written in 1873 to my third great grandmother in one of these boxes. And so it addressed her as free woman, which I'm still researching. I have what I think it means is because everybody in 1873 was free. So the fact that this white man addressed her as that in this letter, to me, it holds a greater significance. Like there's something that, so I'm trying to determine whether or not she was emancipated pre-slavery, before the end of slavery, because I feel as though that's an indicator of that. And so I'm still doing the work on that. And even just last year, the second trip to Alabama, we found my great grandmother's house. And we found, a family member person who had known her. We went to the house. Guy was out there. He was working on the house, and we're just like, we're trying to figure out, which house it is. And he's like, you know what? I just bought this house over here that I'm getting ready to rehab. And I found these pictures and an obituary in there. And so, he goes to get it. I'm, of course, obituaries, death certificates, all those things excite me. So I'm waiting for him to come back. He actually came back with my great grandmother's obituary. She died in 1979. We've got this letter from him in 2019. It had been in that house all these years. So it's just things like that where you make these discoveries, you make these finds that they're required to do that. You can't do everything online. It requires a lot of footwork, but it's definitely rewarding when you get affirmations such as that, this is good stuff. Like to have that. And he even gave me a quilt that he'd found in the house that I talked to one of my great aunts, who's 98. And she said that, yes, she's the one who moved her mother out of Alabama because she was sick. And she said they left a lot of stuff behind and that they quilted and did all the time. And he just gave it to me. So these are gifts that he's given me that I can then pass on to other family members. And so I always encourage people, whenever possible, to travel to the places of your ancestors, because you never know what you'll find. Because 40 years later, there was a quilt, there was an iron that you can't tell me my grandmother didn't use to iron. One of those iron, those kind that you put on the stove. He let me have that. In addition to, there was pictures of my uncle from his senior year. This is a 1960 something. These pictures were from, and all this has just been sitting in that house for 40 years. So things like that, those type of discoveries come about as a result of going there and walking that ground and really being in that space, if you could at all, make that happen.
Now, I know that we typically, as mental health clinicians, we use genograms, genomaps as like a intervention tool. So what we'll typically do with clients is it'll be a way to map out the family relationship, and they'll use different squares or circles and lines connecting the relationships. And it'll just be like, it'll start with the individual that we're working with, and they'll map out their parents. They might map out if they're, married to other spouses, their siblings, half siblings and stuff like that. So we'll do like an introduction version of that in order to use that to catapult into the next conversation, to be a little bit more structured, to say, now what is your relationship with all of these people that you're drawing on this map? And it's a a very basic way of genealogy, but it's also a therapeutic intervention, but it's also can tend to be an icebreaker as well, to get the client to talk about, even though you're drawing your parents here, what is your current connection to those people? And then the connections that your parents have with, spouses that they could have, or children that are, have siblings and stuff like that. So it still uses the genealogy format to still talk about the family dynamics. And sometimes, it can be, a great tool to use to get them talking. Or unfortunately, you'll see some clients, when they see it in a picture in that format and all these connecting shapes and the names inside those shapes, it can be a way for them to shut down and just say, oh, I don't want to talk about that. So we use a form of that to connect to the client, to figure out the person in their environment and who's included in that environment.
With talking about having to go places to travel to get this primary information, as people of color, and if a person of color is wanting to do this research, what are the considerations to take when traveling through the South or through rural areas, both from a mental standpoint and also just research-wise?
I can speak to both of those. In 2015, the first time we went to Alabama, the area we go to is Choctaw County. It's Listman, is the city in particular. It's still a very small place. And the first time I went with a research partner who's a DNA cousin of mine. We were met with resistance because they didn't know us. So they still had that small town, type mentality. And it's also something too that's perpetuated in, I think, large degree in communities of colors, particularly the Black community, where we don't talk to outsiders, like that's our business. And so me asking about family type information was the same as me, questioning about, there's a sense of protection that they have. So if you're doing that, what I would suggest is to connect with people who live locally, if at all possible, whether it be a direct relative or someone who you, have come across. And the way you would find those people, like, through Ancestry, through the genealogy. There's tons of groups on Facebook. There's blogs. But just make a personal connection in that town before you go, because you'll get a lot further with an introduction from somebody who is trusted in the community than you will walking on your own. I have one woman who's actually a cousin that I know is a cousin, and she knew we were coming. But when we got there, she started acting like she couldn't hear me on the phone. It was the craziest thing. She was just like, hold on, like we just talked like a week ago and I told you. And then she's like, huh? Like, hold on, let me have somebody else call you. And so it was frustrating, to come all that way and not be able to get that information. But then I just learned better for next time when making the connection to better fortify that connection for the future. And so the second time when I went, there was another person who I met up with, and he took me, my mom, and my kids. He took us around to relatives' homes, knocking on the door, like, hey, this is, so, they're giving out like, home phone numbers. And that's something that, I don't know if it's a California thing or whatever, you always tell people like, well, give me your information and I'll give it to them and, they can contact you. They still have phone books. They still use the phone book. Like people's names are in the phone book. So like, get the phone book out, like, oh yeah, call so-and-so. There's that number. Like it didn't, once you bridge that gap, it was just like open highway. So that's what I would suggest, is to try to find, somebody that you can connect with locally to deal with that.
But it's definitely an etiquette to going down south anywhere. And what I'm finding is that even with listening to your story, Shelby, it's like the etiquette breaks down into other standards of etiquette depending on where you go. Because it's like the South, it's an etiquette. But then if you're in Alabama, in a certain town in Alabama, there are certain things you have to do. So that makes sense. And I don't think people, they speak to it in terms of like the way the South does things, almost like a way of just like, backwards and just looking down on it. But when you're doing research and when you're going into towns, asking questions, asking for people to give you documents or to at least review them with you, it's like, who are you? And I'm still not doing it. Because there was a film By Any Other Name that Stephen did, and I was an interview consultant with him as well as doing some videography work. So we went to Jackson, Georgia, and Thomaston. Now, I'm from Virginia, and I'm from, the southeastern region of Virginia, which is, military town, very diverse, so it's different than other regions of Virginia. So going to Georgia and the rural parts of Georgia, like Jackson, was strikingly different. The rural aspect is one thing, but it's like the further you go into the town, it's like you feel, and I hate to be this way, but it's just like you feel the negative energy in the air in terms of whatever that is. I would like to think maybe it was just really humid that day, but the further you go into that town and you interact with people there, you know, they all have a different kind of attitude. It's just not, it's different from like an attitude of like, I'm having a bad day or I don't like you. It's something different, and I can't quite articulate it in language, but when I try to express it, it's like the racism, you could feel it the same way you feel the wind blowing. And it's constricting in a way, but you know that it's there. And you can't, I know for me, I struggled with putting a language to it, but I knew that there was something in place that when you go into this place, you know, there's an etiquette that you need to adhere to, and there's a certain caution that you have to do. So even when we came there, we had to meet with certain people in order to ask certain questions about Stephen's family and the people of that town and how they conducted slavery in that town versus it being agricultural or domestic based and things like that. So there were certain people that we had to talk to. And even with talking to those certain people, they were saying that they had to have a city hall meeting about what information they were going to tell us. And when they were, you know, with the intensity of being down there that deep in the South in the sticks anyway, it's like that was overwhelming. But I had to completely come back to Atlanta to process like that was deep in reference to, you know, there had to be a committee of white people and probably other people in the community of color to say, what are we going to tell them? And what information do we want them to have? And how are we going to handle it when it starts going in a certain direction? So that in itself was a different experience, but it put me in mind of that when Shelby was sharing her story about Alabama, because the southeastern region of America is just different, you know, and I like it. I'm a Southern girl, but it's different, you know, going to the South in Georgia and the deep parts of Georgia are not the same as Alabama, and probably aren't the same in like Louisiana or Mississippi. It breaks down depending on where you're at. And that needs to be more openly expressed so people don't just catapult themselves down to like, you know, Mississippi and Shreveport or something. And why weren't these people talking to me? Like, wait a second, what were you asking? What were you doing? You know, that's not to say that you should be treated poorly, you shouldn't be, but this is information that you're asking people to talk about, and they understand that there are people behind these documents. There are events attached to these people behind documents. So no, I'm not going to come off that information because, you know, it could implicate something with an entire family. So I need to know who you are, and then I still need to decide. So it's, you know, it just requires a different kind of work.
I think also, especially going in person and having to dig through those documents, we are so used to being able to type in a name and get, you know, every single possible thing that you forget there are traditions and etiquette and all of the stuff that goes along with gathering this information. And in smaller towns like Jackson, like there are people that have been entrusted with having that information. So then they're, you know, it is their job to vet you to see, is it good for me to give you that? Mm-hmm. So I think with people getting into genealogy, it is kind of shocking that, wait, I have to go to what do you mean I have to go to a courthouse? I can't just look it up. Come on.
And also understanding that there's more there, that no matter how much you find, there's more. I mean,
sure.
It'll help you, the online, and especially now in these COVID times where we're really restricted in our ability to, you know, move freely and go to actual courthouses. So we're really now restricted to the online world for the large majority. But there's just, and even if you don't find anything, just being physically in that space and whatever that current dynamic in that town is, especially when you're talking about with small towns, when you're from a bigger city, it gives you a perspective that you can't get, that you can't, you know, necessarily fully understand on the internet. Because like you're there, like when Anjail was talking about the, you know, just, I kind of think of like, you know, the gut feeling, like, you know, the instinctual, like danger, like based on who I am as a Black person in this place. Like, I'm not safe here. Can you imagine, like, you're doing that in the 2000s? Can you imagine what it was like in the, you know, early 1900s? Like all these years of supposed progress have taken place, and this is still the foundation of this area, and this is still, you know, how they feel about us. it hasn't changed here the way that it has changed, it's perceived to have been changed, in terms of how we conduct ourselves in some of the bigger cities. It's like, this is the root cause, and this is where a lot of, this comes from. Just because people leave here and go to bigger towns doesn't mean that they don't take the small town mentality with them to these places. And so it just is like a refresher course in real life, like what's really happening versus the ideal world we try to paint.
So while people are interested in all of this, how do they protect themselves from in this process? What can they do when they're doing genealogy, both research-wise and from the mental health perspective?
You mean like
one thing
emotional themselves?
Well, I can answer the mental health aspect. So one of the things that they can do is to just revisit, some things that help make them feel whole and help them feel like I'm putting back into my personal, bank, if you will, in terms of making sure that my glass is full to the top, if you will. And so, and that could be a lot of different things for different people, for a lot of us, it can be faith. For a lot of us, it can be just reading the biblical text, reading the Quranic text, whichever one that you practice. And then sometimes it could be the ritual of what we're doing. So for some people, like we were mentioning before, it could be, gardening and the routine of gardening. And one thing I wanted to ask you was like, are you paying attention to the sounds that are around you as you're gardening and tending to the plants and stuff like that? But sound can also play a part in reference to how you pursue your daily routine. So you want to think about, the things that help you feel more whole and more connected and more grounded in things that you're doing, and create spaces for that. Actively create your time for that. And even if there might be, if you're doing a routine of genealogy and research, and there might be a time when you're not able to pursue your activity of whatever you're doing, to make a commitment to go back to it. Because again, when you do that, you're reinvesting into prioritizing yourself in that. So almost like with self-care, a lot of this self-care thing is being thrown around a lot, which is important, but what's more important than self-care is understanding why the self-care is in place. Because if not, you're going to be doing a lot of random crap. And so what we don't want to do is just, okay, well, I like to stretch for 5 minutes, and that's my coping skill, and that's a part of my self-care. But it's in response to what? And so it's in response to help me, control the level of anxiety that I know that I tend to feel when I go out in the morning, or it controls the level of frustration that I tend to feel when I'm doing research and I can't connect the dots to answers that I need. So in order to pursue self-care, in order to be committed to prioritizing yourself, you have to know what it's in response to when it's not there. And, in order to complement that, because we can't, because a part of life is a lot of the positive emotions that we like to feel, but we want to isolate our lives in those positive spaces. But unfortunately, it's a tide, it's an ebb and flow with positive and negative. We want to create a space to constructively understand our negative emotions, but in order to not get swept up in the wave of the negative emotions, we have to create the routine of what we do in order to give back to ourselves. And the way we do that is by understanding what are the things that contribute to my happiness, that contribute to my joy. How do I create time for that and carve that out? Because when I do that and I commit to that, I put myself as a top priority. So when I go into these difficult conversations and intense conversations, I'm able to be objective, but I can talk a little bit about transparency. I can talk a little bit about the empathy piece of it, but then I can go back to the objective piece, and I can balance those conversations better once I know that I'm prioritizing my emotions, my self-care, and ultimately overall myself, that's separate from the task at hand.
Thank you. So as we start wrapping up, I know it doesn't seem like we've been doing this for all that long, but what are some tangible things that people can do and some resources if they're wanting to start the process of genealogy?
I would say go to ourgeneticlegacy.com. You can participate in our projects. We're converting our courses to be online. So we're currently beta testing, but we, try to disseminate information regarding like what's happening in the research world of genealogy and changes that are going on with, using DNA, availability of records. If you're like wanting to start immediately, I always, the order of start that I tell people is Ancestry.com, then 23andMe, download your raw DNA from those two sites for GEDmatch, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, because you want to spread your net as wide as possible, because all these different testing sites, you have to keep remembering that it only goes against other people who have tested on that site. So that's why you need to, spread your net as wide as possible. And then just make sure that you're verifying sources. Like if you're using Ancestry and you see somebody's tree on there and they have all your family members on there, don't just do the cut and paste from their tree. Find the source, because sometimes that information is incorrect. And if they have done the same thing that you did, one wrong tree will make every tree thereafter wrong. And you just keep perpetuating that same wrong information. But I think that's the biggest beginner mistake, is to just put it in there and be like, oh, look, somebody already did the tree. I can just, cut and paste everything from here, but never actually look at the actual documents, or they don't have any documents. So use those as hints, but don't use them as gospel. Find the primary source documents to confirm everything that you can. And if it's in the event you can't find it and it's an oral story that, a family member has told you, record that story, type out that transcription, and then add that to your evidence of why you put that there. But the biggest thing is to document the journey, and to make sure that you're focusing on the things that you know. And if it's something that you think, you need to say that. But generally, family trees are supposed to be what you know.
And then Anjail, should there be like a mental health check that somebody does before they start, just to kind of see where they want to go with it, make sure they don't get too deep into it? Or what have you experienced or seen that has been helpful?
So it's a couple of different things, but I want to start off just by saying, you want to initially have your own supports for yourself. Again, going back to making yourself feel whole and going out to pursue aspects of joy that don't necessarily depend on anyone else, but things that you can do on your own. So you want to understand what those things are, like we were talking about before, in terms of gardening, how it makes you feel, about the routine, things that you notice that you're doing mindfully. Those are things that can contribute, that you do on a daily basis. But when you notice the emotion, and then you notice your relationship to those things when you don't do them, and when you commit to that routine, and how it prioritizes you in your routine, noticing how that feels. So I would suggest before going into the work of genealogy, do not underestimate the emotional heavy lifting that's required. If you're partnering with somebody doing the genealogy, do not project that heavy lifting as something they should do. It's not. So it's always going to be a limit to what they're going to be able to provide for support, because the idea is that you have to be finding your own support after you're able to put the genealogy away. And when you make yourself a priority before going into genealogy, I would think that it boosts your resilience to be able to handle the changes and the frequency of how things change as you go through that process of finding answers to your family. And then also what I would want people to think about and to consider is your personal relationship to silence. Silence in relation to your family contacts, silence in relationship to yourself and how you engage in silence. What I find is that, there are a lot of things that tend to break down negatively with families when we stop talking and when we stop speaking to different issues, but silence doesn't answer questions and it doesn't save you in a family context. But it's important to understand what your relationship is to silence and what your family relationship is to silence before you go into genealogy, to kind of understand that, because that is a heavy influence on the dynamics of how family operates in terms of systems, in terms of subsystems, and how all of that influences it. But silence can be a heavy ingredient there in terms of exchanging information, giving information, or not talking about certain names that haven't been spoken about in 50 years, 100 years, et cetera. So, examine your relationship to silence. and the emotional attachment to how that feels in terms of a family context and in terms of an individual context. Because oftentimes when you're pursuing silence as an individual, it can be a healing space. It can be a place of understanding and a place of calm and peace. But what does that look like in a larger dynamics when you throw genealogy on top of it? And what does that look like when people are refusing to talk? And what does it look like when people are talking a lot, but they're not answering the question or talking around different things? So examine your personal relationship to silence, and then also take a closer look at what silence looks like in a family dynamic. And then what's the emotional piece there that you have with that?
And then our last question, we've made it to the end. I could listen to both of you talk pretty much forever, but I understand you probably want to go on with your lives for the day.
I have more death certificates to look for.
So once you are starting to gather this information, or whenever you have gotten to a point to where you've gotten an abundance of your tree, or you've done your DNA matches, how do you form your identity around all of this information? Or do you
right?
form?
I don't know. I would say I think your identity has been formed before you do the work. It may alter some things, but I feel like who you are, to date, that doesn't change. So I guess you would, integrate the parts of it that you're comfortable with, like Anjail was saying, to determine what the emotion is behind the different, aspects of it. And then, choose your focus and how you want to share that information. But it was already a part of you, you just didn't know it. So when you're doing that research, you're not discovering new things so much. It was already part of your foundation, because that was already part of your genetic legacy in terms of your, biology. And then it may help you in terms of understanding why you do some of the things that you do. It may give you direction on how not to continue to, or be on a certain path and see a relative where that didn't go so well. So we figure out how to redirect myself and use that to, correct where I couldn't see it when I'm looking, I was too close to it looking at myself. But now when I see it in somebody else, I can see like, oh, I see those similarities and I see where that led, and I don't want that for me. So I think it's very, very personal in terms of how you figure out how to express the things that are already within you.
Okay. Do you have anything to add, Anjail?
So when it comes to identity, it's an interesting topic because there's a lot of intersections with identity and other people groups, in terms of that being a hot topic right now. But it's also just as important for Black people to try to understand identity first before pursuing the intersectionality, because there are other people groups that have a better understanding of who they are, because they don't have the same attachment to other, they don't have an attachment to slavery in the same way as African Americans do. So we might jump to the intersection part and just say, yeah, Black people are still trying to figure out their identity the same way as other groups are, but it's a little bit different because, going back to the silence piece, there are people that are choosing not to talk to us or choosing to withhold information, which can therefore stagnate how we answer the questions of where we came from and who we are and who we would like to be. So, and that in itself requires healing work attached to it when you put the research down, because if there's a family member in Louisiana that's not answering the phone call, but has the information to a census record that I need in order to answer a question, and they keep not answering my phone call, that might make me feel angry. And that might trigger some other spaces of anger for me that requires a level of healing work, but you're not the only one with that experience. And as African Americans, some of us have more clear-cut stories of where we come from than a lot of us don't. And if we don't acknowledge the healing work that that's required for Black people to do in that space, we'll want to step over that and not speak to that emotional work and just say, hey, well, you know, we're trying to figure it out like everybody else. Yeah, but it's a different context with African Americans. And we have to start there to work within that context of how it's different for us, how we can heal, how we can identify who we are from a strength-based perspective in order for that to be the space where we get to heal ourselves in that regard. So then we can move forward to say, well, here's who we are, here's who I am, here's how this information informs who I am, but I still get to decide who I would like to be.
Thank you. So I want to thank you both for taking the time out of your day to come and connect with me and with our audience online. They had a bunch of very good questions for the both of you. And I appreciate personally this conversation. So if people want to connect with you further, how would they go about doing that?
So I can be reached at ourgeneticlegacy.com. I also have a Facebook page and an Instagram page. They're both Our Genetic Legacy, is all one word. And you can follow those pages to keep up to date on the projects, and also where I share information regarding genealogy and doing research.
Thank you.
And you can find me on Facebook. You can find me through just typing in my name, Anjail, M. Haqq, MSW, and that should take you straight to my Facebook page. You can also email me, anjailhaqmsw@gmail.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Thank you both for coming. And we have just two more little things. So on July 28th at 8 p.m., there will be a Black Indians of North Carolina conversation circle that Stephen will be a part of. And that is on Tuesday. So you can find that at Black Indians NC on facebook.com. Also, if you would like to connect with AARCC, you can find us at AARCC Center at all of the social media. We hope to have more roundtables on different topics and discussions. We're working diligently to try to have something every month on different topics that involve both Indigenous and African American people and the intersectionality and how that connects. And if you have anything that you would like to be a part of, you can always contact us at any of those social medias. So if there's nothing else, we are done for the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And nice meeting you, Shellie.
You too. Bye.
See you.
Bye.
And bye, Dee.